We're here today to talk about innovation in the government market, and it would be easy to kind of make that joke that, oh, innovation in government, you really can't put those in the same sentence, but that's really unfair and untrue, because when you think about the mission of government and how generally successful the government is at serving that mission and meeting that mission, there's a lot of innovation going on inside the halls of government. But that doesn't mean that it's easy to get your ideas and your products and your solutions in front of those customers. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And we have a great pair of panelists here that have a couple of different perspectives on the market. We have Bill LaPlante, who is the Vice President of the Intelligence Portfolio in the National Security Engineering Center here at MITRE. And before MITRE, he had a long government career, including being Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition. So
it felt long, but it was really about 3 years.
And we also have Rick Gordon, who is the managing partner with Mach 37, a cybersecurity accelerator, which helps cybersecurity startups, crack the government market, helping them with, funding and finding funding and advice and counsel. So before I jump into the questions I have, I thought I'd just ask each of them to kind of tell a little bit about themselves, but also just sort of where they sit in this ecosystem. So, Bill, why don't you go first?
So I'm right now the VP here at MITRE for the intelligence portfolio for the past year. But prior to that, for almost 3 years, I was the acquisition executive for the Air Force. Before that, I spent most of my career, all of my career, at UARCs and FFRDCs. And I guess one thing, a couple points I'd make. One is that it's sort of like when you go visit a country, you can read all about it, you can watch videos, but when you actually go there and live with the people, it's always surprising. It's not what you think. That sort of was my experience when I became the acquisition executive for the Air Force. It really is not what you think. A lot of the things that you hear and see are exaggerated or maybe aren't provided in context. It doesn't mean that if you hear acquisition is bad, that there's not bad acquisition. There is, but so one of the things I think I'm going to offer to you all is sort of what I saw from the inside with regard to innovation, and particularly with regard to engagement with industry, whether it's small business, startups, or the big guys. So it was very eye-opening for me, and I'll share that in this discussion. And finally, I've been hearing a lot about the Innovation Bridge, but as some of you know, those of us that live in Maryland and commute to McLean spend a lot of time stuck on that Innovation Bridge. Anyway, just stop.
Love it. Great, thanks. Rick?
Sure. So where do we sit sort of with respect to the Innovation Bridge? So, Mach 37 was founded as an accelerator about 3.5 years ago. Really, our whole purpose was to harness this rich intellectual capital base that we see in this region, and that, stretches in cybersecurity really from Fort Meade down through Alexandria and then out beyond Herndon, to leverage that rich intellectual capital base that is unparalleled. We have more cybersecurity experts in the DMV than any place on the planet. But what we weren't seeing was that sort of leading edge or bleeding edge intellectual capital or knowledge being applied or embedded in technologies that can be consumed by anybody other than very large government organizations, and in some cases maybe the Fortune 10. And so what we hypothesized was that was because we didn't have an ecosystem in this region that was supportive of technical founders actually getting their companies launched, getting them funded, and then ultimately growing to being not just small technology companies, but large software businesses. And so we built an accelerator, a system that focuses on bringing all those pieces and parts that may not exist in as great abundance as that intellectual capital, things like early stage capital, things like mentorship or knowledge on the business side of growing a security product company. Things like how do you, what is the vision for a business that would inspire a seed investor to give you money. So we've been doing it for the last 3.5 years. We've launched 40 innovative security product companies, and I think in general, have established a reputation for being, at least in our space, the premier accelerator in the world for security.
Okay, great. I thought we'd start maybe with something very basic. What is innovation? Maybe each of you kind of give your definition and where you look for it.
Yeah, so I know there's been lots of studies and books on it, and I'm not going to recite, because I don't remember it, some of the academic definitions of innovation. What I always think of it as, it's not enough to have an idea. The idea has to actually get into capability. I mean, I'm sorry to be cynical about it, but I think we have lots of ideas, but if they don't go anywhere, it doesn't matter. And so to me, it's clever. The innovation can be the concept, the technology, but the innovation can be the contracting mechanism. The innovation can be the incentive structure that is set up to grow the marketplace. The innovation can be, a lot of times in the government, for example, we are told, rightfully so, to make use of commercial technologies. But on our part, it's hard for us to figure out where the commercial market is going, because if the commercial market takes a hard turn to the right, and we're stuck there with a military system that's depending on the thing that was delivered 3 years ago, we're the only ones left using that BlackBerry or something, Not that that would ever happen to the government. And that's something I think a lot of people maybe don't appreciate outside. I certainly didn't appreciate it, is that, and I often say it this way, if you're familiar with Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, there's an inverse of that, which I think is something like, when you're in particularly national security, you can't bet on markets that don't exist. You just can't. If you did, you would, unless you're a prescient and you predict right all the time, you're going to be screwing over the country. As I always say, about in the 90s, most of us were building L-band antennas on everything in all different form factors. Why? Because not just GPS was coming along, but because of the sky was going to be blotted out with LEO commercial SATCOM. And of course, that didn't happen. And so fortunately, the military kept military SATCOM. And I would say, if you don't believe me, let's talk to each other on our teledester phone, and we'll finish that conversation. So the innovation is as much figuring how you can take advantage of that market and yet make it a sustainable action. And there's lots of ideas on how to do it. One is just do things fast, repeat fast. So if you throw a phone away every 2 years, that's okay, right? The government often doesn't keep things for 2 years. Look at a government car. So that's something I think that is an innovation as much as anything else in the technology.
So yeah, I like all of that. I might actually steal some of that in coming opportunities. Innovation. I had a conversation yesterday, a purely academic one, about what innovation was, and in particular what disruptive innovation was. And I think at the end of the conversation, the conclusion was, well, I don't know, when I see it, I'll recognize it. It is like that. But I would say this, at least perhaps echoing your comments. There are all kinds of ways to innovate. Certainly, technology breakthroughs are interesting, and we have a business focused on technical founders that have done something, notionally innovative in the particular sector. That isn't always, a technical breakthrough. Though Sven, one of our founders, clearly, you guys had a technical breakthrough in a way to handle, securing smaller, less capable devices. But there are other ways to do it. Within the cybersecurity market writ large, in some cases, it's just writing better software. The security industry in general for the past decade has written software that is, interesting, but not usable in any concept of operations that exists outside of Fortune 2. And so, innovating and finding out or learning for security experts to actually learn how to build software that is consumable by the Fortune 2000 is clearly innovation, and something that that we continue to look for as well.
Rick, in your opening, you mentioned an ecosystem. You were talking about sort of, innovation isn't worth anything if it doesn't have an application. An idea isn't worth anything if it doesn't have application. So, where is that? Is there like a point where innovation is going to die, or how does it get over that gap? Sort of what's missing in the ecosystem, I guess, feeds that, but also where does innovation die?
So let's try to talk. I'll talk positively about where it lives, and then we'll talk about the many ways it dies. And where it lives, is when the actual mission owner, could be the customer, in the government, it typically whoever owns the mission, when they grasp what it means and how it can make their job better, that usually tips it over. Because if there's a groundswell, it'll get in the system. In a warfighter example, if the warfighters get something out in the field and they love it, the system can stop it sometimes, but usually not. And so, but you got to get the mission owner to love it, and a lot of times the people you're talking to are not the mission owner. The mission owners typically are not here in Washington. They can't. There's some, maybe in cyber they are, but largely they're not here in Washington. So that's what tips it over the edge. What usually kills it is a couple things. One is that to do the learning. Learning is as much innovation as anything else. Rapidly trying things and seeing what happens. There is actually a discipline to experimentation. People think that there isn't, or that you just throw things up against the wall and see what happens. There's actually a discipline to throwing things up against the wall. It's called campaign of experimentation. It's called discovery experimentation. It looks sort of messy if you don't really understand what they're doing, but it's sort of like I always use Elon Musk landing the first stage, or attempting to land the first stage of his Falcon 9 on the barge. That's what he's doing. Okay, he's doing it actually in a very disciplined way. Unfortunately, the Chinese are doing it too with some of their stuff. But too often we stop after one or two times and say either, well, that was really cool. Look at that. Why doesn't somebody pick it up?
Right.
And that doesn't happen. And you wonder why. Or if it fails, if the first stage doesn't land on the barge, we declare failure and we stop, which is not what SpaceX did. And I've always say this to people, if you're following SpaceX, I think the 5th time they tried it, they landed the first stage on the barge. And the reason he's doing this is he's trying to close the business case for space travel. You can reuse the first stage. Well, if the most forward-leaning part of the DoD tried that, through DARPA, whose mission is to disrupt, they would have tried it the first 2 times and stopped. Because it's just like hypersonics, they did the same thing. If it was the Air Force, we would have tried it once and we would have had an IG after us in a congressional investigation.
Right, right.
So that's one of the reasons this stuff it fails too often, is it's particularly in the government, we have, I'm sorry to be a soapbox about it, but we have somehow convinced ourselves that taxpayer money used at something that initially doesn't work is a total waste of money. And it can be, but it's not at all necessarily so.
Yeah, so that's a really good example of what kills it. I think, particularly in environments that are politicized, when someone's continually hunting for that failure to leverage to their advantage, I do think that kills it. And I think that's not only present in sort of government ecosystems, it's certainly present in big company ecosystems. But one really, I think, great example of a company that I think does it really well, if you're at least in security, is Bank of America. One of our mentors is a gentleman named Sunil Yu, who's self-described mad scientist. They have systematized the notion of would you say throwing ideas against the wall. I would say throwing spaghetti against the wall with an expectation that there's a high failure rate, and I think. Success is judged on, not whether there's an 80 to 90% success rate, but whether there's a 10 or 20% success rate. And I think that, when you've got a large company that's sort of at least institutionalized that in acceptance that we're going to continue to do that, I think that you've created an ecosystem that will continue to drive innovative ideas. I think similarly, from a career perspective, you see even in my industry for large companies, the innovators eventually leave because the culture does not exist. If you take a risk in like Elon Musk can do, but you're 4 layers down in the organization and that you fail, your career's done. So, good answer to that question.
I just want to piggyback on something real quick, because I want to give a shout out to Dr. Melissa Flagg, who's here somewhere. I'm going to embarrass her. Where are you, Melissa? There she is. Melissa, who's a very innovative person, has been in and out of government, and she mentioned a couple months ago that, with all these different experiments and innovation going on, the DOIXs, the VC models, the InQtels, most agencies seem to have something that they're trying. Is anybody looking systemically across all of these and seeing who's trying what, who's doing what part of the experiment, whether they know they are or not, and which are the ones that seem to be working and why. And I think that would be a fascinating thing to look at, and it's Melissa's idea, so I'm not going to give any credit to myself.
It's a great idea.
I'm unemployed in 3 weeks.
You know, can I just add a little bit more to that? There, and maybe this is tying that concept to the innovation bridge. One of the things that is missing in great abundance in this region is I think an appreciation for the importance of good product management skill sets. And we hammer that in our program. We have a 14-week program. The first 3 weeks are all focused around, okay, what is it that you think you want to do, and why do you think that's important? Is there a market for that? Is somebody else actually delivering that already? And if they aren't, then what's the opportunity for you to solve a problem of large scale? And oftentimes, when you find innovators, particularly technical innovators, there is a disconnect along the way, and so you might have something that's slightly innovative that never really gets to market because it doesn't solve a big enough problem. I think that happens all the time. But you asked, I can tell you where we think it occurs, at least in our industry, and it's really consistent with what you said. It's not the data scientist that really is looking for a new way to use graphs to identify unusual relationships. It's the analyst sitting in the bowels of a security operations center that has an event that keeps him at work late, and he has to miss his children's soccer game. And that analyst is inconvenienced because the technology that he has to work or she has to work with does not fit their concept of operations. So they build something to get home early. And we look heavily for innovation in those kinds of places.
So, the government is the biggest customer in the world, federal government. Very risk averse, the way you all described it, which I hear all the time. So how, and large government contractors as well are very risk averse. How do you get over that hump? I mean, and how do you find that guy in the bowels? I mean,
In the government?
yeah.
It's that's hard. It's getting better. I know we've discussed this before. So I just one anecdote. I was fortunate enough to serve an executive position at a company called Looking Glass, which is now a leader in the threat intelligence arena. But when we were just starting out, I mean, no one really knew what threat intelligence was, and certainly not a threat intelligence platform, which is now a space, but didn't exist when we were building this company. And our first customers were government, which is in some cases ironic because I don't always drive our entrepreneurs toward government, but in this particular case, if we didn't have our DHS as our first customer and the CIA as our second customer, that company wouldn't exist. And honestly, because of the innovation that they were driving, because of their mission need, threat intelligence would not be as far along today. And we're not done, by the way. There's still a lot of innovation that has to occur for it to work. It wouldn't have gotten to where it is today without that sponsorship. But it was not easy to find those sponsors. And then even once we found those sponsors, I'll tell you, I won't get specific, but the antibodies circled in. I mean, it was we were creating efficiencies. We were perhaps hijacking an idea that the prime wanted to build anyway. And we just happened to, because we built a product that did 90% of it. It was that final 10% that the antibodies will actually try to leverage to try to get you killed, so they can build what they want. So that was difficult. Eventually, it all worked out in the end. But for a small company to figure out how to navigate those situations is really tough.
And I think I'll just pile on that. I think that one of the things I said in the pre-interview was that if you can, really seek out the parts of the government that are the good parts that are pulling things off. It's not, unfortunately, the majority, by the way. It's probably a minority. But if you can find those innovative offices that are doing more leaning forward things like other transactional authority or whatever,
Yeah.
and they have top cover, flock to their door. Don't assume, and I know hopefully people don't assume that all the government is equally the same risk averse. There's actually parts that are really, really bright spots. And it's the whole thing of, the best people hire and fire their bosses. Hire that part of the government, okay? And I'll just give one example that maybe some of you have heard about that I was a big fan of, I am a big fan of. The Air Force has something called the Rapid Capability Office, RCO. It stood up in 2003. And most of what it does is highly, highly classified. But I can mention two things that they do that shows you how interesting it is. Number one is they deliver things really, really fast, and it gets right to the warfighter or to the intelligence community. They got access to the best contractors, the best industry teams in the country, and the best labs. You can't tell the RCO they don't know about Silicon Valley. They were in Silicon Valley, before everybody else in Washington got on the airplanes and went out there. So I'll mention two things they're doing just to give you an idea. One is that they're doing the X-37. You ever seen the things of the X-37 space plane? They did that. They do innovative things in protecting Washington. They're doing the new bomber for the Air Force. In fact, one of the first things that I was told when I went into my job is, when are you going to move the bomber out of the RCO? And I said, why? He says, because it's outside the standard process. Oh, then I'm not going to move it. What does it have? What do these offices, and they all have the same qualities. Number one, they typically have top cover. So the RCO, they report just to a board of directors of the Secretary of the Air Force, AT&L, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and my former job, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. They don't go through all this staffing, okay? They can use all types of contracting authorities. The Hill loves them. They brief the Hill all the time, and they deliver. And the mission owners love them, okay? But to point out the antibodies really try to, they always are trying to stop it. Again, move the bomber out of there because it will be excessively successful if you keep it there. So, that's the thing you've got to look for those places. They're around in the government. Now, why are folks risk averse? There's lots of reasons. We are a little hypocritical in our political system. I don't mean political Democrat, Republican. I'm talking about in the broad sense, because I use this story. I was talking to the big advocate of commercialization on the Hill for defense, Bill Greenwald. Many of you probably know Bill. Great guy. And he's like, you guys are just not using commercial stuff enough. You're not using this. I said, Bill, but you see all the IG reports that found out we paid too much for some airplane parts? Well, yeah, what's that? I go, our contracting officers are scared to death. So, they're going to dig into all these commercial items because they know they're going to have to prove to an IG that they didn't get ripped off. And of course, I always tell people, if an IG was following me around in my personal life buying commercial items, I would be in jail. Because I always spend too much for things because sometimes I'm too busy. I don't have time to do all the market research. So I think that's kind of stuff is in the system. It's not to be anybody's bad. It's that we can't decide as American public what we want. We want to make sure there is never another $600 hammer, the IG, then we go contracting officer, or we really want innovation. I'm not sure that those two are compatible.
That's good thought. So just one observation I have about the ecosystem. So you mentioned pockets of innovation too that have sort of popped up in recent years. DIUX is an example. What DoD's doing, and then I guess DHS has a Silicon Valley Innovation Program, which just saying the word Silicon Valley actually sticks in my craw, but it's not a bad idea, and they're actually bigger than just Silicon Valley. I think I'll start lobbying for name change for that one. But they are, and I think that's a really good leading indicator that across government there's a recognition that the way that we procure is difficult. It makes it difficult for innovators to actually get their products into the market, and so there's a ton of inertia to overcome. But I just think we're a hell of a lot better off now than we were even 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think that just a classic example is the FAR. The FAR by itself, actually, if you have the time, like you're on a 3-month vacation and you want to read it, you'll find that actually it allows you to do almost anything. Very creative, but it's been so imposing by the size of the FAR and then all the lure around it that people don't use it. I think the thing that's really made a bit of a difference in the last 5 years is, it's a cliche to say leadership, but leadership. I mean, one of the best things about DUIX, whether or not you believe itself it's being successful at the moment, which I think it's still the jury's out, what is really cool about what Ash Carter has done is he is educating the public and the Congress that we gotta think about innovation differently, and we've got to get into a less risk-averse posture, or we're going to get beat. And to me, the burning platform, again, of being a national security guy, is not cost or anything else. It's that unfortunately we're losing our superiority. I actually think if we don't do something, we're going to not be the superior military in certain parts of the world in a few years. It's that urgent. And so I think that's actually the killer app, the killer burning platform behind the innovation. It's not just because we want to innovate. If we don't, we're toast.
You know, that brings,
No, go ahead.
there's been a lot of talk over the last year, the third offset. And can you talk about how, one, explain a little bit, what that is and sort of how that has the potential to drive innovation?
I can say a few words and then I'll turn it over to my colleague here.
Definitely not the person
Yeah,
to answer that
so
question.
as I understand it, and I've heard many times, I've listened to Bob work and talked to him, it essentially goes as follows, that in the 1950s, the United States militarily, particularly in Europe, was confronted with a vastly superior Soviet conventional army. I mean, it was just not even close. And of course, the concern was the Soviets could, in one day, have their feet up on the desk in Paris, and the U.S. would be just sitting there because of how the superior numbers. So we offset that frankly, by nuclear weapons, what we would call today tactical nuclear weapons. We distributed them at the tactical level in Europe. You can't even imagine this today. We distributed the command and control of them almost locally, and that was to offset the superior military. Okay, the second offset, historically speaking, happened sort of in the mid-'70s to the late '70s. It was when it was recognized that there was a potential, that as the Soviets again were getting comparable to us, that we needed something to challenge that, and became agreed upon that things like precision weapons, which PNT, as they call it, PNT, using PNT, GPS, stealth, and other things, that we would overcome, again, the massive size of the Soviet Union's forces by these exquisite technologies that the world saw in the first Gulf War. And we're living off of that to this day. So what Bob Work and others have recognized is say, well, we've been living off this for about 30 years, and everybody has watched how we fight now, and they're attacking our seams. So time for a third offset. Okay, so what is it going to be? I don't think people know. I think you hear that what's going to be is learning, autonomy, but I think it's essentially him saying there's a call to arms. We've got to come up with the game changers, just like what happened in the 50s with nuclear weapons, and just what happened in the 70s with stealth and precision navigation. And so, so that's the way I look at it. So whatever you call it, the next administration may decide, I'm going to throw the term third offset out because I've decided it's Washington and we throw terms out every 3 years. So it's like transformation, don't use that anymore. Maybe we won't use it. But I'll tell you, the problem statement is remaining with us, which is that if we don't do something innovative, game-changing, again, we're not going to be the most powerful military in the world. And that includes in places like cyber, and it includes, unfortunately, places like space. If the American public knew the situation in space, they would be horrified. And that's part of also this, is that we have to start, unfortunately, educating the American public and declassify some of these things, because then people, I think, would recognize what all we're talking about here.
So, Rick, I know your specialty is cyber, so you can maybe talk about, because cyber has become one of the domains of military operations with air and land, sea, and space. How's that?
How's it impacting your national security?
Yeah.
So I'm certainly not a national security expert, but I would. It's certainly disrupted it. The way that we think about warfare, so I would say the way that we think about national security, and even perhaps more importantly, Richard Clark was talking about this a decade ago, disrupting our economic security. Those are. Cyber in general, at least on the offensive side, I think that it's been incredibly disruptive. And then, making sure that all of our armed forces have the ability to, control that domain certainly preparing the battle space. Can be an incredibly efficient weapon. And so we spend heavily on it. Probably, well, I'm sure we spend more than anybody else. Any other country, we just don't talk about it. I think on where I spend more time thinking about the impact of cyber is really on sort of our economic security perspective. When our country's economy has evolved away from manufacturing and into services, and then and beyond services because of outsourcing into innovation, where we invent things, and then so much of our economy is predicated on our ability to allow capitalism to work, and that research and development economy and innovation economy to be rewarded. Then it works. But when your national treasure is that intellectual capital that we continue to invest in and grow and invent, and that gets exfiltrated, to China, for example, then the pillar upon which you built your economic security just starts to crumble. And I think that is where we are. I don't think we think a lot about it. I think cyber is typically mostly thought of, has, let's say, outside of the last couple of years, has really been thought to be, more of a military national security issue. I think our economy is potentially in peril, because of it.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I don't think the Chinese. I mean, this is from just observing them in the open, not anything classified. I don't think they separate military cyber and economic cyber.
Not at all.
I don't think they worry too much about that boundary. I think it's all the same to them. It's national power.
Yep.
And so if you can steal the IP, whether it's for commercial applications or for the F-35, steal it. And that's what they've done. And they've done it systemically over the last decade. And, and people talk about, well, we need to apply deterrence strategy to cyber, which may be a perfectly valid thing.
All right.
But we're not close to that. As they say with deterrence, you need the 3 C's: clarity, capability, and credibility. Well, clarity is essentially, does the adversary actually understand what you'll do, and clear words. I don't think China understands what we would do, other than name and shame.
I'm not sure we know what we would do.
We know what we would do. Now, sometimes people say, well, ambiguity is good. Well, ambiguity may be good for a while in deterrence, but then they start poking at it and saying, well, what will the Americans do if I do this? Nothing. Well, how about I try this? Nothing. Right. So ambiguity is going away there. Then you got capability. Well, capability I think we have. We probably could do some big damage to other countries if we wanted. But the last piece is the hardest: credibility. Do they actually believe the United States would do it?
Right.
We will never allow North Korea to have a nuclear weapon. So that's what I mean by credibility. So I think that's why we're such in the infant stage of the cyber issue. And again, looking at it from an IP and stealing of industry and military separately is not the way the Chinese are looking at it. And I don't mean only pick on the Chinese. They're just the easiest example.
Yeah, so could I just add to that? Yeah, it's not fair to pick on Chinese because it's not the only ones doing it. It must have been, couldn't have been 5, maybe 6 years ago. I had the opportunity to meet, with some senior level people in the equivalent of the Department of Commerce for India. And it was very clear to me that part of their economic growth strategy was migrating away from outsourcing and let's say overdependence on software development, and essentially stealing intellectual capital around our pharmaceutical industry and making things cheaper. And you start to think about what that can do to our industry, where so much of that R&D is done here. I mean, it really unravels it. And so, it's not just the Chinese.
But I think what they're most afraid of, they're most afraid of our innovation. That's what they're because that's what America has always had. And that's why I think it's right that the leaders in the government are saying that's where we need to put the focus.
Now, way to bring that back to innovation. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're getting kind of high side. So just one last question. Best advice to startups trying to
get in the government?
Get in government. What do you tell them first?
Build great software. Make sure you're solving a problem look, you're building, I think you build a product that is consumable by the deck seaman or the security analyst that's in the bowels of the organization. and start there. Start by building, something that solves, that individual's problem. And then, once you've done that, people will buy it. My philosophy is if my company can sell a product to JP Morgan, then Department of Education is going to buy the thing. And so I just continue to focus on that, solve a problem that a person has, because those are the people that are actually going to either advocate for it or purchase it.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think that particularly in software, it seems like the most important attribute to be successful in designing having good software is actually having the best software team. You can put all the oversight you want, but if the actual software developers aren't good, it doesn't matter. So if you attract the best software developers, deliver something practical, deliver it fast, and deliver it to a part of the government that's actually got a track record of success, or a company, and show it to the government's successful thing, you'll have a good shot. But again, remember, all the government is not equal. Find the places in the government where word of mouth says these guys are willing to take a risk, and they've got credibility, and they deliver. And if you work for them, you'll probably be successful. A's hire A's, B's hire C's.
Right, well, great.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.